Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Charlotte Limousin from Delphis, and I will introduce a little bit more who or what is Delphis. And I'm in charge of the last session of today. We had, I think, great presentations this morning and earlier, so I think this last session will be as interesting as the first two. And maybe just as an introduction, I heard this morning a sentence that I quite like. It's maybe a bit basic, but you have to have a dream before you organize it. Mr. Arnfred said that this morning. And I think this is important, and I think the conclusion this morning was also that we have to think about what we want to be and what we want to do in 20 years' time and be proactive on that instead of being passive. And I think that's what we're going to discuss also in this last session. So first, what is Delphis? It's not a national social housing federation. It's a network of housing providers, of 27 housing providers from France. And we're working on innovation and exchange of good practices on different subjects, including corporate social responsibility that I will present today. We are a founding member of the network ERHIN, that you may know, which gathers about 30 organizations in Europe. And we have been involved in CSR since 2006. Maybe you've heard about the ERHIN, which is a framework for CSR in social housing. And I'm the coordinator of the ERHIN project that we will discuss and that I will present today. So first, the title of today's conference was Responsible Housing. But what is responsible housing? And I think that may be the dream that we want to achieve and that we want to create together with our partners in the coming years. And we have defined, and when I say we, it's based on interviews that we've made with different actors from the sector, as responsible housing as a fair and ethical housing production and management. And I think fair and ethical are important words in today's context. And I also think that it's important to stress on production, but also management and services. We'll see that. So responsible housing, it's about housing design and services, and we've talked a lot about housing design this morning, and I think we also mentioned services to tenants, to inhabitants, and I think this is a core dimension of what we do. And housing design and services that answer, of course, population's housing needs, energy efficient and low environmental impact housing. And it's a form of housing which also promotes social inclusion, social mix, and local development attractiveness. So that's for the housing design and services. But I think, or we think, that responsible housing is also about housing organizations themselves and what they want to be and what is their role and their place in society, in communities, and with other actors. So that's the global picture, and as I said, I think that's the goal that we should seek to achieve, but we will not be able to do that by our own, on our own. We will need partnerships, and we've seen interesting examples of partnerships, and I think that's an important point. But I think to mobilize that, we need corporate social responsibility is what housing providers at their level can do to stimulate responsible housing, to stimulate partnerships, and to try to create with their partners what they want to provide for communities. So CSR, we present it as a global management framework. This is the definition from the European Commission, the responsibility of enterprises for their impacts on society. So when we say social responsibility, is of course not about only social aspects, but also environment and everything which affects society. And what I think is important to keep in mind is that CSR is not only about what you do, but it's also about how you do it. Because the whole process of delivering housing and delivering services also has impacts on society, and this is what we should also look at. So for us, CSR is in fact, it's a concept, and we have to admit that. It's a concept, but it's a very useful global management framework. And when I say global, it's because it means that you have everything, or you should have everything in mind. You should look at all the dimensions of your activity, all the impacts of your activity, of the processes. And it's also about being aware and fully aware of all the needs, all the expectations, and we've seen earlier on the presentations that there are growing and changing expectations today towards social housing and housing providers in general. There are changing social needs. We've talked about vulnerability, but there is also the challenge of aging, the challenge of new forms of family, which impacts the housing needs and the housing forms. So there are these social needs, but there are also environmental constraints that we cannot ignore. There are growing economic constraints that we also have to address. And this is why we have to need to have all this in mind if we want to deliver what we call responsible housing. The other idea on CSR is that you have to move from a self-centered focus to a more collective perspective. Because the difficult point is about balancing all this dimension. We've mentioned environment, economic, social, and everything. Sometimes you have conflicting or diverging objectives. And the question is, how do you balance that? How do you decide when you know that if you put too much on the environment, it might increase the cost for your tenants? So how do you decide in that? And I think the solution is also in collective dialogue and having all the people around. It's also about ensuring and increasing legitimacy, and I think that's a big issue also for the sector. I will not go into details about practical examples because we've had examples earlier this afternoon, and we will have some more with a roundtable. So I just wanted to set the general framework, and of course, if you have questions, I can answer questions. I will only present our ERHIN projects that we are implementing with SECODAS and the International Union of Tenants. And this ERHIN project is about promoting and developing CSR in the European affordable housing sector. So I will go through the main components and maybe tell you what we may expect from you or what can be interesting for you and for your members, I think. First, we have a CSR roadmap for the sector, and I will explain later what it entails. We've also set up a stakeholder forum at European level. We will have European Responsible Housing Awards. And lastly, we've set up an online resource center, and you have the website address there. So these are the main components. And I will now go into more detail. What is this CSR roadmap for the sector? It basically aims to provide a general framework on what the sector sees in CSR and in responsible housing and what we want to promote for the sector. And it also aims at identifying key priorities for housing federations to help and support their members in implementing CSR. And we've seen the examples from BL earlier on. And this is this type of initiatives that we want to highlight. Of course, it's not a binding document or a binding commitment. It's more intended as tools, as a toolbox, as recommendations or guidelines to help you help your members. So the priorities that have been identified based on interviews that I've conducted with several federations and housing providers, there are the ones written here. So we have 6 priorities. The first is about awareness raising and leadership, not only towards your members, towards housing providers, but also towards partners and stakeholders, such as the construction sector, but also tenants, local authorities in general, etc. Then the second priority is about promoting and improving transparency and accountability. And that came up as a very strong priority and strong expectation from society and from local authorities and public authorities in different countries. Third priority is about developing stakeholder dialogue and partnerships, and that's what we will also discuss later on. Fourth priority is about supporting operational implementation, and we've seen again earlier on with the Danish case, Danish example, that they've provided also a lot of tools to their members. They've developed a guide or a checklist, and that's the kind of things that we also want to promote, and based on what already exists. The fifth priority is about the assessment and measurement of shared value, so of also social impact for communities, and we will discuss this maybe a little bit later. And lastly, the sixth priority is about recognition, because we believe that there's a lot of things that are being done today, but they're not maybe very visible, and they probably lack recognition from the general public, from authorities, from financial institutions, and there are mechanisms that start to emerge here and there, and I think we should take example from that and see what could be done to improve and increase this recognition. So this roadmap will be refined and should be endorsed by September next year. And so far we've done the survey and the preliminary roadmap, and now we're collecting feedback from federations and stakeholders. And so if you have input, if you want to participate in that, if you want to give suggestions, you're more than welcome. This is the first element. The second one is the stakeholder forum at European level. So we've gathered 12 organizations, and this forum is chaired by the International Union of Tenants, by actually Barbara, who is with us today. And we held our first meeting on November 7th. This forum should lead to a joint declaration on what is responsible housing, viewed by housing providers, housing federations, and their stakeholders at European level, and why responsible housing should be promoted at European level. And we will try to create a CSR charter as a voluntary commitment that can be signed by social housing providers. I don't know if you're familiar with the UN Global Compact, but it will be the same idea. So it's something which quite light, but which demonstrates and shows that you are committed to CSR, and it sets a number of general principles. That's the idea. So we will try to get to that for the housing sector. All this will be delivered by May next year. So again, if you want to give your inputs or your suggestions, you're more than welcome. Third thing, the European Responsible Housing Awards. This is also about getting more recognition and giving more visibility to what is being done in the sector, because there are a lot of things that are great. There are a lot of very, very interesting projects that are not well known. So we will organize the first edition of the European Responsible Awards next year. And all your members, all housing organizations that are represented within SECODAS are invited to submit applications for good practices relating to CSR. They don't have to label it CSR, even if they don't have like a proper labeled CSR strategy, as long as it's a good practice that can fit in one of these 5 categories, they can submit it. And we will have a jury with the members of the stakeholder forum, because we think it's important that stakeholders also give their criteria for what is a good practice according to them. And so we will have the selection, and best practices will be gathered into a handbook that can be used then by others to get inspirations also. And the ceremony will be held on October the 6th, 2014, which is International Tenants Day, right, Barbara? And so the application forms are to be submitted between January and March next year. So if you want more information, I'm available later on. And I think it would be great if you could also mobilize your members and tell them about that. And I think it's a great opportunity for your members and for you to collect that. And this leads me to the last point, which is the online resource center. You remember, one of the 6 priorities that we mentioned was about supporting operational implementation. This means giving access to tools, to examples of good practices that have already been developed, because I think there is no need to reinvent the wheel. When something good exists, you may as well try to use it and replicate before starting something from scratch. So that's the whole idea of this online resource center. We're collecting good practices and putting them online. Everyone, again, is invited to provide examples of good practices in any language. It does not need to be in English. And we are also collecting CSR reports, because there are a lot of CSR reports that are actually published in the sector. And surprisingly, I think probably many more than in comparable sectors. So I think it would be good also to show that to the external world, that people or organizations are ready to be transparent and accountable on what they're doing and their impact on society. So again, if your members want to submit good practices, or if you want to submit good practices and CSR reports, just send them to us and we will put them on the website. These are the main dimensions of our project. Again, I'm available afterwards for any questions you may have. But right now, I think I will leave the floor to our roundtable, because I think they have very interesting practices to share as well. And I think after that, we will open questions, I think, if that's okay, and if we're on time, of course. Thank you very much.